Good morning, everybody. I think we are all set to begin. Thanks for coming this morning to the third and final event of this year's Tanner Lectures, roundtable discussion. It's been a wonderful event so far, and Achille Mbembe, in the middle, research professor from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, needs no further introduction at this point. Joining him this morning are two treasures from the Yale faculty. Inderpal Grewal is a professor affiliated with several programs, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, where she is chair. You're still chair there?
Yes.
Yes, you are still chair. American Studies, Ethnicity, Race, and Migration Studies, and the South Asian Studies Council. I think I've hit them all, but if there are more, let me know. Her latest book out just a few months ago, in fact, from Duke, is Saving the Security State, Exceptional Citizens in 21st Century America. Michael Denning is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor, and likewise multiply affiliated with American Studies, English, and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration Studies. He also co-directs the Initiative on Labor and Culture at Yale. His latest book, from Verso, out a few years ago, is Noise Uprising, the Audio Politics of a World Musical Revolution. A word about how we'll proceed this morning. Professors Grewal and Denning will each speak briefly, opening out some questions and issues from the lectures you've heard over the last two afternoons. Professor Mbembe will respond, and our three panelists will then shape the conversation as they wish. After 50 minutes or so, we'll open the conversation to questions from the floor, and after that, we'll adjourn to the reception room straight down the hall behind you for a light lunch and more conversation. Thank you all for being here. Take it away.
Thank you. I guess I begin.
Okay.
So first to thank Gary for making this happen, for Achille for being here, and for giving two fantastic lectures that resonated with some of the key questions of the day and some of the key theoretical issues that we grapple with in studying race, migration, postcoloniality. So what you said, Achille, spoke very much to many of our key concerns, not only topical, but theoretical, research-wise as well. And, you know, in the second lecture, I think one of the key issues that you brought up was the question of migration and the movement of Africans around Europe and North America, and what is called the crisis of migration, but rather is a kind of scandal and a crime of migration, one might say, in Europe as well. So some of those questions really spoke very loudly to us. And you began in the first lecture with talking about a very different kind of paradigm of mobility that many of us have been thinking about and trying to grapple with, not just in thinking about the present and the ways in which boundaries, walls, the bounds of the nation state, forms of power are not enclosures, but are permeable, right? That they're moving, they're mobile. We're grappling with the kind of mobility, not just of capital, of goods, as you said, but also of persons. But we're also grappling with the mobility of things that we thought were stable, right? The kind of concepts of bounded nation states, the idea of sovereignty, the idea of Westphalian state, all of these that you brought out so importantly. And one of the issues that comes out of that is what you also spoke about in the first lecture, which is the question of sovereignty. Where does sovereignty lie? How does sovereignty move? How does it get, you referred to Saskia Sassens talking about unbundled sovereignty. And, the question there that I would ask of you is, looking back to the work of Thomas Hansen and others who argues that the kind of unbundling and dispersal of sovereignty is not new, that it was a condition of colonialism as well. So one of the issues that I would want to ask you to say more about is the question of not just about the unbundling of sovereignty, but the paradigm of mobility. Is it new? Should we have thought about it as a a question of a changing formation of nation state, or do we think about it in terms of a paradigm shift in which we have always not addressed the mobility of people, right? That mobility is something that has always been there, but the kind of emergence of the Westphalian state and all of these other bounded enclosure-making processes and disciplinarity have not allowed us to see it in some ways, and that we're grappling with it. So that's one of the questions that would be really helpful for us, not just in thinking about the politics, but the organization of knowledge as well in the university, for instance, but disciplinarity, the area states and national boundaries as enclosures of thought as well, of knowledge. So some of that would be, that's one question that I would ask. A second question, I think, is something that you brought up also really importantly that I've been grappling with, is about security regimes. That securitization of borders, of people, is sort of this condition of the present where development has been securitized. Everything is becoming securitized now, and you spoke about that as well. But one of the complex things about security is that I think there's an affective notion of security as well, where people desire some kind of settlement, where people desire care, welfare in particular kinds of spaces. And when you spoke of the kind of utopian thought of mobility, of people being able to move everywhere, one of the things we come up again, and the question yesterday that Alicia was also asking, what do we do with people who want to settle, who want something from a state, who want documents, who want social security, who want care, who want all of these things. So that would be another question to think about. A third would be the question of technology. How do we think of surveillance and technology as, again, not just something, a new kind of project, but rather that technology produces fears and is always harnessed towards certain ideological ends as well. So how is what you talked about as the cellular and fragmented way in which surveillance and technology are produced sort of part of a longer history, right? The kind of fingerprints are a colonial apparatus. So we have these from a really long time. So how do we think of those as well as being part of a history of colonialism that you have shed so much light on and helped us understand in so many ways? So I guess that some of those would be key questions to think about in terms of habitation, abode, the question of settling, the question of people wanting to be in certain places. And my last point would be the kind of question of the verticality of power that you spoke of. A.L. Weitzman and others have talked about the way we need to think of power not just as horizontal or lateral, but as from the sky down, right? That satellites and technologies allow us to think of cities and places in a whole different kind of optic as well. And of course, he uses it in terms of kind of diagnosing human rights abuses and power. But I wonder how you would think about that verticality of power in relation to technology, in relation to the kinds of post-colonial project of migration and enclosure that you were also trying to, grappling with and questioning in all kinds of ways. Right. So I would put out those sort of 4 questions.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Inderpal for having been here, having attended the lectures, and having so attentively and so carefully drawn out the 4 problematics she has just shared with us. all of which I think are extremely useful for any discussion on question of mobility in our times. I think you are absolutely right to insist on the necessity for grounding all of this in a deeper history, or deeper histories for that matter. A condition, I agree, for eliciting possibly what might be new in all that we are seeing right now. A longer history of technologies, longer history of forms of power, a longer history of questions you raise, such as national boundaries, enclosures, modes of thought, and forms of production of knowledge. So I will try to not really respond, but just rebound on what it is that I have heard from you. I don't think the novelty is about technologies as such, talking about technologies in particular. The novelty stems from, I would argue, a phase of the history of capitalism many have characterized as a phase of acceleration. Mm-hmm. The novelty lies in the fact of our having domesticated speed at a level unseen before. I really believe that this question of speed, of velocity, is what is, if there is anything new, that is it. I was referring yesterday to the work of Paul Virilio in particular, since he is one of those who have helped us some extent to understand the centrality of speed in the making and remaking of our world. Domestication of speed as it is related to in particular, this question of light. I mentioned it yesterday almost in passing. I think I should have insisted a bit more on that. Because a number of technologies adduced to warfare, security for that matter, but also the production of wealth in this age of financial capitalism, most of them indeed are maximizing forms of maximization of speed. They rely on speed. The new forms of capitalism rely on speed. I referred to algorithmic trading. There are a number of new studies of those forms of exchange that show indeed the extent to which they, in fact, rely on the, as I said already, production of speed. So speed seems to me to be the novelty. And the organizing principle for the forms of life we're referring to. Now, if indeed speed is becoming the resource for the remaking of our world, it goes without saying that the ultimate forms of sovereignty, the most efficient ways of exercising power, have to do with how to capture speed and how to redistribute speed in unequal ways? Who are those who must go slow, if you want to put it like that? Who are those who might not be able to move? Who are those who might be able to move at a speed with a velocity that is unequally reduced? It seems to me that that's how we have to frame these questions in this age. As far as the organization of knowledge is concerned, a lot of our knowledge in the humanities, in the social sciences, and probably in other fields is predicated on sedentarity. Mm-hmm. It is predicated on people settled somewhere, moving, of course, but moving from within a space that is delimited as fundamentally enclosed locations, places, so forth and so on. So our knowledge mirrors somewhat this partition of the world that is predicated on sedentarity. And if indeed we live in an era of, as I was suggesting, is the planetary entanglement, obviously this requires different forms of production of knowledge. Itinerant knowledge, for instance. It requires a new imagination of institutions, university, that wouldn't have walls, for instance, university beyond walls, knowledge beyond walls. And these experiments are already being, there are places where such experimentations are going on, where people are experimenting with forms of knowledge that would not be bounded either nationally or regionally, forms of knowledge that would circulate, knowledge is in circulation. It seems to me that is the challenge this kind of analysis poses. One last thing, verticality of power. Yes, I have read Yale's work, and in fact, Hazel raised the same issue informally the other night at dinner. What about the vertical, that which comes from the sky? How do we take into consideration not only the sea or the desert, but also the air? And I think it's a very important question. But what strikes me is that, in fact, is the fact that it's the re-articulations of all these optical points of view. Is not the privileging of the sky as such, nor is it the privileging of the terrestrial or the maritime. It's the process of conversion of the maritime into the terrestrial into the sky. It's that circulation between different optical points of view which seems to me to be going on, and which seems to me to be producing an entirely new paradigm of power, sovereignty, and domination. And the transformation of all of this into codes and data, including the transformation of the human itself into a code and into a data. And therefore the distance, let's say, the leaving behind us of old model of the human, with which the humanities have been working. And today is the human appended to an object, the human appended to an animal, the human appended to different other species beings, and all of that captured into codes and data. And that is what seems to me to be the novelty. So it's a long and tortuous answer to your question.
So can I press you on one quick
Yes,
question,
yes.
which is that some thinkers are talking about your mention of algorithms, that is now what is sovereign is data. That we're now thinking about an unbundling of sovereignty, and we have what you see is the kind of sovereignty of data. But on the other hand,
the sovereign is one
the
who
kind of racial algorithm
Definitely.
argument also suggests that data is not that sovereign all on its own, but
no.
that's informed by the very
It
forces.
is. It is absolutely informed. It is shaped and reshaped by various other factors, including race, gender, class, and the rest. It's not neutral, nor is it objective. It's not at all objective.
Okay. Oh, I could continue, but let me ask a couple other questions, which I think are actually from the other side of your account of geopolitics and biopolitics. You know, you gave us a powerful, I want to thank you for the powerful account of the mobile and portable border, the way border work and border processing and border enforcement can move anywhere in some ways and is now in the interstices of daily life. And it made me think of how across the traffic routes in particular, where mobile beings move, not only airports with their various security lines, which we're so aware of, but I was thinking indeed of roads and highways with their speed cameras, their easy passes, the rules of the road that have actually made driver's licenses such an important issue for undocumented workers and for migrants in that kind of way. And also I actually want to thank you for that powerful assertion of the right of all mobile mammals to move around the earth, to extend, as you said, to the poor members of the earth, the taken for granted rights of the U.S. passport. But I wonder whether the issue of borders and the question of movement are really the same question. Since, as you yourself put it, the business of a border to be crossed, and movement might be nothing more than the crossing of borders. I was thinking this morning as I crossed from the town of Guilford into the city of New Haven, that moment when we cross the border from Connecticut in New York and see the looming towers of Manhattan and that sort of excitement. And whether or not borders are really about movement or the issue of free movement, then, as you also said at one point, about the ways of classifying people. And if what you mean by a borderless world is not a world of free movement, but a world of where people are not classified. And that might be a different way to think this. So let me ask two questions following that. One on the biopolitics and geopolitics of sovereignty, which you raised, and one on what one might call the bioeconomics and geoeconomics of accumulation. So the first, I'm kind of intrigued to hear more about the implications of Ghana's right to abode as a kind of refiguring. What are the philosophical implications of that refiguring of sovereignty, which, from my very quick study, seems to involve two different aspects. One is the right of Ghanaians to move freely in Ghana, the right to leave and enter Ghana, immunity from expulsion from Ghana, exactly the right that I had to drive from Guilford to New York or to California in that way. But secondly, and more remarkably, the extension of that right in the Act of 2000, as I understand it, to a person of African descent in the diaspora. That's the quote. And so this is a right that includes the right to remain indefinitely, the right to work without a work permit, the right to come without a visa, the right to have children and dependents covered by that same abode. And so I guess my question is, do you raise this as fundamentally a part of a politics of reparations? Is this really a sense of repairing the forced confinement, the chained migration of the Atlantic slave trade, the divisions of the continent you talked about in Berlin? Or is this a sense that the full freedom of movement of human mammals depends perhaps less on an abstract call for open borders than on the repair of specific migratory circuits, historical circuits, the reforging of the links of what our president has denounced as chain migration? And the second question, so that's all one question, I guess. You powerfully begin both days with the question, to whom does the earth belong? And who determines its partition and distribution? And yet your answers focused, vitally, no doubt, on the borders that were maintained by sovereign states. But doesn't the question of the partition of the earth also depend as much on the partition of the earth as different capital, as private property owned by transnational corporations with no trespassing signs there, border work that's done by an army of security guards, often staffed by those mobile migrants disproportionately, with the temporary issuing of permits and passes to get onto those spaces, as well as the gated communities of private homeowners. Again, both of those in some ways outside the state, again serviced by the labor of migrants, but who are off limits to those ones. And I guess, so I would wonder, how does one imagine, and this is really to return to Alicia's question, which I won't try to repeat, but I'll actually just quote her from a written piece because I couldn't read. But how do we imagine a new mobility of humans that isn't simply the flexibility of labor for the movement of capital, but a new kind of, and here's where I'm quoting her, a new kind of migrant justice that would allow migrants to achieve and exercise social power without obtaining formal citizenship, where migrants would be binational civic actors, where there's some kind of space between not being a citizen or being a citizen, and whether that raises. And I guess the final question then is, partly you quite provocatively suggested that mobility was the motor of social and economic change, and not actually internal struggles inside a society. And I was intrigued at whether, having thought so long and hard about changes in 20th century South Africa and across the South African continent, is it true? What were the forms of mobility that actually caused those social transformations and economic transformations, so as to see how migrants might, in the 21st century, so reshape the world?
Yes. Okay. These are all very, very interesting comments and questions. Let me speak first about the right of abode, since you picked it up as a key element of yesterday's presentation. I don't think that in the Ghanaian understanding it is conceived as being part of the fourth freedom we spoke about yesterday. It's not, at least not immediately thought of in those terms. In terms of Ghana or Africa, for that matter, being able to institute a regime of flexible labor, market labor circulation, and so forth and so on. That is taken care of by the treaty that has just been signed in Kigali, which I referred to yesterday, the Single Market Treaty, which would allow possibly the movement of labor from places of production to to the rest. So the right to abode encompasses a number of aspects. Its aim is to make sure, as you indicated, that Ghanaians and Africans in general, or people of African descent, take ownership of this specific space called Africa. Ghana being one instantiation of that larger space, which would mean they have the right to come in, they have the right to settle, they have the right to work, they have the right to be taken care of insofar as the state attends to matters of care, and they have the right to come and go. But the right of abode is also understood as a specific right extended to people of African origin that, as a result of historical circumstances, have happened to be located elsewhere. It is similar in that sense to the right of return Israel has instituted for Jewish people, the Jewish diaspora. And you're absolutely right to suggest that there is a reparative element in it, and an implicit recognition of the responsibility of African powers in the whole business of the Atlantic slave trade in particular. But this reparative element has to do with self-reparation. And in fact, in the juridical debates that preceded the adoption of this specific article of the Constitution, that reparative dimension was explicitly spoken about. So it seems to me that the concept of the right to abode is somewhat of a response, Inderpal, to the question you were asking, saying some people want to settle, some people want to be taken care of. So it's part of that. It's part of an attempt at making sure that people of African descent or African people find on this earth that presumably belongs to all, a place where they do not have to justify who they are, why they are there, and what they are doing there. Where to be black is no longer a liability, because there doesn't seem to be such a place in our world right now where you are not forced to justify why you are black. So the right of abode would be that mechanism that allows you to not have to be classified and to not have to justify why you are who you are. That's how I would expand the concept of reparation when applied to this specific type of right. You are also right to suggest that there are various modalities of partition of the earth. We have the Westphalian model where states apportion parts of the earth and distribute it among themselves. But there are other modalities that are, I suggested yesterday, maybe not strongly enough, operated by the works of capital. In a place such as Johannesburg, in the aftermath of apartheid, urban planning by governmental agencies hardly operates any longer. The city is rebuilt basically by private agencies. They decide where they want to create new suburbs. They build the roads. They give names to the boulevards and the avenues. And in building such new suburbs, they reproduce the mechanisms of segregation, or they ratify the modes of redistribution of urban space which used to operate under apartheid or not. So it's no longer just the prerogative of the state. Capital is very much involved in making, remaking, or unmaking borders. What forms of mobility might cause what types of transformations? This is an interesting sociological question. In the South African case, in fact, the collapse of apartheid was the result of people mobilizing, of course, via political activities, but it was also the result of the collapse of the pass system. The pass system was a system whereby South Africa was carved into internal borders, because blacks were not citizens of the South African state, because they were citizens of the Bantustans. They needed permits to come and work in those places where they could find jobs. They were not city residents as such. At a certain point in time during the day, I think 5 o'clock or 5:30, they were supposed to leave the city and go and reside in specific places that were allocated specially to them. Their presence in the city necessitated the possession of a pass. So what happens by the mid-80s is a massive campaign of disobedience where people decide they are no longer going to carry passes. And you have an influx. The influx control laws collapse entirely. Influx control laws were the laws regulating internal migrations within South Africa itself, laws which were racially, of course, configured. It collapses. People go into cities. In Johannesburg, for instance, the most cosmopolitan neighborhood, Hillbrow, which was peopled, inhabited early on, especially by people from the Jewish diaspora, it's overwhelmed by the arrival of those who were not supposed to be there. That's how apartheid becomes partly ungovernable, in addition, of course, to the manipulation of unleashing of insurrectionary violence. So we see in this instance how it is that the capacity for people to move changes the urban configuration. It changes completely the ways in which the apparatus of capture, which is the state, operates, and leads to changes, let's say social transformations. But I'm sure we could extend this example to others elsewhere in the continent. So just to finish on that, I think that there is migrants are bearers of specific transformation capacities we haven't examined seriously. Migrancy is probably one of those resources those who would like to change the world today should invest in eliciting and unleashing. How? That's the topic for the next annual lecture.
I guess we should open it up to...
Yeah.
Okay. So if I could press you a little bit on the last question. I think Michael read the quote from Alicia, which sort of suggests a different kind of moving the migrant away from capture by labor and capital to something else. And I'm wondering about the kind of ways in which European modernity took mobility as liberatory because it came from modernist notions of exile, itinerance, adventure, all of those things. So one of the shadows, if one might say, of mobility is that sort of colonial history of mobility as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so the struggle, it seems to me, in what Alicia is saying, Michael says, is how to take that shadow away from migration, one hand of capital, one hand of sort of a linked European kind of project of modernity to somewhere else. And what that might be is indeed utopian, but how to imagine that utopia is, I think, the kind of struggle that we're dealing with. Mm-hmm. Right? And what constitutes mobility as the engine of that is the other question.
I think one would have to take some very specific cases to answer this. As I was suggesting yesterday, in pre-colonial Africa, mobility was the norm. It was really the norm. In some societies, what was not normal was the sedentarity, the fact of settling in a place and being in the same place from generation to generation. You even have historical, I'm talking about fiction, historical examples of kingdoms that were moving kingdoms. That you kingdoms that were not limited to one territory, they were constantly in motion. The same thing with trade caravans. I mean, the concept of a caravan applied not only to trade but also to political formations. Things were on motion was the nomos, if you want. That was the law. And once again, these are historical examples. In West Africa, in Central Africa, present-day Congo, Angola, and like that, kingdoms moving from the Atlantic coast towards the Indian Ocean and changing in the context, bringing on board new people, capturing new religions, instituting new social relations and aesthetic forms. So that was the... now, when we talk about mobility and colonialism, the colonial logic in that context this is how it operates. First of all, it operates on the basis of settlement. Settlement along the coasts to begin with. Entrepôts, that the combination of warfare and trade and missionizing Christianity. These are the three. So it operates on the basis of partition of a territory that is, first of all, imagined because it has no borders as such. It's progressively that borders are instituted in negotiation with local inhabitants, but mostly in negotiation with other European powers, all of which culminates with the Berlin Conference, which I referred to in the first night. So it's a patchy thing, absolutely open-ended, messy, it has no rationale. You have borders, I mean, you take a rule and basically you trace a line. It doesn't matter what is there. It's a big line. If you have a map of Africa, look at, for instance, the border between Algeria and Mali. It's just like this. It cuts through a pre-existing territory that was totally fluid because it was the Sahara Desert. Totally nomadic, people circulated on that, boom, you put a rule. Same thing with the border between Angola and Botswana. A straightforward line. No consideration of anything, people, mountains, rivers. Some borders consider rivers and physical markers, but others don't. So that is what happens with colonialism. And then when the colonial state is properly instituted after conquest and occupation, and when it's operating, it needs then to regulate people's movements and the movement of goods. The movement of goods is unidirectional. You have the hinterland and you have the coast. Anything produced in the hinterland has to go through the coast and shipped outside. The extractive economy we have today, which is at the basis, therefore, of the regulation of movements. So you have poles where, let's say here they specialize in the production of cotton, over there production of palm oil, and you need labor to be working in these units. And the biggest problem of colonialism in the continent was the problem of labor, because there didn't seem to ever be enough laborers. I mean, in South Africa, that is absolutely the case. They have to go outside of South Africa, in Mozambique, in Malawi, in places as far as Zambia, Zimbabwe, southern Congo, to bring labor to work in the mines in the Witwatersrand. And in so doing, you create a regional constellation with regulated movements, because these are seasonal workers, they come and go. Borders don't really matter that much. In the case of Southern Africa, they matter and they don't. They matter because of the politics of states, but they don't because the economic demand requires that they be opened. So the business of the colonial state is to simultaneously institute borders, but render them flexible enough to make it possible for the process of accumulation to keep going on. So what is it that I want to say in relation to your question? I think that we have to do a proper case study kind of exercise in order to elicit the many different ways in which colonialism makes, remakes, and makes borders. So we inherit all of that. And in fact, I believe that people within the continent were able to move more freely under colonialism than, than after colonialism. What we see after colonialism is crystallization of state borders, the emergence of the border becomes a rent. It becomes a rent for those social classes that control the states. They use it to extract rents, which was not the case under colonialism, which aggravates, let's say, diminishes Africans' possibilities of moving freely within their own continent. So it's a long response, but it just shows the extent to which I think when we say colonialism, there are many different.
Could I add to that question?
Yeah.
And then we'll throw it out. It's just your earlier discussion of speed and acceleration, because it might seem that actually acceleration and speed makes location and space much more important. So that the response to the speed at light of algorithmic trading is that you actually have to be located even closer to Wall Street because of the microseconds that the time that it takes to engage in that. And that in many ways that the acceleration that you were talking about in speed means that one has to be more tightly connected to the infrastructure of speed, whether that is airports or data lines or interstates or whatever, that makes it much more difficult for people who are what you called go slow, but are actually perhaps walking at a normal human pace.
But I would add to that, not just speed, but perhaps scale. So the potentiality of algorithmic trading is its ability to capture vast amounts of money by scaling up, by just pennies and fractions. But they're so large in volume and scale that they become so big. So the scalar advancement, it seems to me, are critical in this as well.
No, definitely.
And the connection was simply on your own explanation of how the infrastructure of the ports, which at one sense was an acceleration and a speeding up of moving commodities around the world, actually ended up prohibiting earlier forms of mobility.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
I think we're ready.
Thank you very much. My name is Mary Evelyn Tucker at the Environment School. I'm sorry I couldn't come to the other lectures because of teaching. So this question would relate to migration due to climate change or environmental issues, both in North Africa and now what we're seeing in South Africa because of water depletion and so on. So I wonder if you might have touched on this already, but I'd love to have your comments on this because there's 19 million refugees for climate change alone now around the world. But clearly the African continent has been particularly severely hit by drought and other issues.
I think it's a combination of many different factors. Some of them are ecological and environmental, but some of these ecological or environmental factors are themselves the product of human-induced catastrophes. For instance, the wars in the Great Lakes region, which comprises the Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, are, according to the UN, have caused millions of victims over a very short period of time. When you add the genocide in Rwanda and all that has been going on, the wars of predation in the eastern Congo, a few million people. But they have also caused serious environmental consequences, which were not there before the war. So the war produces ecological catastrophes, which in turn result in further wars. Most of them wars of extraction, cobalt. I mean, when every time you open your computer, a lot of your computer, parts of your computer, they are coming from there. They are coming from the Congo. Your computer, to a large extent, is made up of wealth, mineral wealth extracted from the Congo as a result of the militarization of the economy. Militarization, paramilitarization of the economy. The two combined. So the extractive part and the abstract part, all together linked in a continuum, we do not study, because we study economies of extraction as if they were just located there, and the financialization as part of Wall Street. But there is a link between Wall Street and Eastern Congo. So people migrate for all kinds of reasons. I mean, in Johannesburg, we have been living in Johannesburg for the last 17 years, and we see the city changing. Entire neighborhoods, people only speak in Lingala or in some other languages from the rest of the continent. These are people who, some of them are running away from terrible political systems. Others are coming because they want to make a living. They will live better. They will earn a little more. They will send money to the places where they come from. So the reasons are many.
What about no water?
Oh, they are busy. I mean, it's a serious matter, of course. The question of water and water politics is a geopolitical question. It's in South Africa. It is the result of long years of drought. It's also the result of, I would say, bad planning. We know very well that the big issue for parts of South Africa is water. There have been attempts at directing, capturing parts of the water in the Congo and linking it up with Southern Africa. This is possible. The studies have been done. There's not enough political will to do so. So it's all of that. But the ecological question clearly is in some parts of the world at the heart of processes of migration. But it's not the only one.
So thank you, and thank you all for your kind references to my thing on this work. I want to say again, thank you. For me, these lectures have been extraordinary invitations to expand our imaginary, the political imaginary, the ethical imaginary. And so I wanted to ask you to perhaps I found your invocation of the Dogon and the network systems and the debt systems very illuminating for showing us other forms of social relations tied to land and kinship and membership to this place. And I wondered how that might be placed in conversation with the traditions of African socialism. So as to think about another piece of the hostility and racism imbued by colonialism, not only in Africa, but the Americas, in Australia against the Aboriginal populations, that mobile people were represented as more primitive, not only because they would not conform to the sedentary order, the imperative of being sedentary, but because they seemed to be people who could not be productive users of land because they did not accumulate. And the imperative in the post-colonial era, as you've written about beautifully, is a new administrative control of the economies of the former colonized nations by insisting and demanding certain modes of production accumulation. So I wanted to ask you if there's a way to connect the vision that you gave us around the pre-colonial social worlds and forms of habitation to another vision of a African socialism, which is also a rich tradition. Thank you.
Okay. There have been historical experiences of socialism in the continent since the end of colonialism. Different kinds of experiments in Guinea-Conakry, in Angola, in Mozambique, even in Senegal. Senghor, for instance, was a major theorist of African socialism. And of course, in Tanzania, Tanzania was the most advanced experiment in that sense with Nyerere and his concept of ujamaa. Most of those experiments have failed, quote unquote. They have failed to the extent that today you hardly find anybody even doing research on so-called African socialisms. Most of these, from, let's say, theoretical or ideological point of view, most of these experiments were aiming at domesticating, let's say, Marx, basically. They were part of a project of domestication of Marx in the conditions of Africa. And the overall premise was that these African societies were governed by the law of community. Distinction between what is communal and what is individual. And that property relations were hardly privatized. Property relations were communal. Land belonged to a community rather than to individuals. There was an element of this that was true, and another element that was highly mythical. But look, politics, it's about truth, it's also about myth, nothing wrong with that. Now, you are asking me to make a link between what I said yesterday about African pre-colonial geometrics and the idea of African socialism. I don't think there was a direct connection talking about these historical experiments. There was hardly any connection. There was an exercise of reinvention of traditions or some elements of so-called traditions for purposes of political efficacy. Otherwise, what I was trying to say was that if we look at the different, I call them archives of the world, something we could call the African archive, to be defined on that. If we look at the different archives of the world, this allows us to imagine let's say different paradigms of almost everything, of how gender relations can be organized, how it is that property relations are organized, what types of relations people have with the divine, religious field. There is a multiplicity of paradigms. If we think in terms of the planetary, in terms of the humanity as a whole, which are not reducible to those paradigms that ended up dominating our world, mostly Western paradigms coming from one form of human experience. So the call was to, in this age when we are so interconnected, we cannot produce knowledge that is simply provincial. What our world requires now are forms of knowledges that are as much as possible a manifestation of the multiplicities of the archives we inherit. So if the debate is about how to govern mobility in this century, which, by the way, by the end of this century, the biggest number of people in our world will be coming from the continent of Africa. By 2050, Africa will have recovered the demographic gap it suffered during the Atlantic slave trade. And by the end of the century, most living beings, human beings on Earth, will be found in the continent. Nigeria will be bigger, demographically speaking, than the United States of America. The youngest people on Earth will be coming from there. We'll have a kind of map of the world population in which the oldest people and the smaller number of people will be located in places such as here, Europe, Japan, of course, partly Latin America, and the biggest number of youngest people will be coming from Asia and particularly Africa. So the question of who owns the earth, how do we divide it, how do we apportion it, will be resolved partly through the demographic calculus. So demography will become geopolitics. It already is. And naturally, what we will see is a process which is already going on. We call it migration, crisis, whatever. That's the wrong term. What is going on is a process of, I don't know the term in English. In French, it is repeuplement. Repeuplement is the process of, it was like under colonialism. Colonialism was a form of repeuplement of the world. People go into Australia, South Africa, Asia, and all of that. It won't happen like that by the end of this century. It won't happen like that because we are beyond colonialism. Unless we go and colonize another planet. But it will happen through population people moving. The key is it will be unlocked by people moving in spite of borders. That's how the earth will be repeopled, if you want. I don't know what the term repeuplement means in English. You will find it, but that's what I'm talking about. So, now if we want to understand, therefore, that process, it seems to me we have to open as many archives as possible. So the question of the government of human mobility in this century cannot be resolved exclusively by looking into the anti-humanist archive of the West. Because when it comes to borders, people's movements, the Western archive is anti-human. It is pro-capital, if you're pro-commodity. The question of the fourth freedom, it privileges things over people. in the continent, if we look at the archive of the continent, people and things are interwoven. You cannot allow things to move freely without allowing people to go with them. Because if you separate people from things, you destroy both people and things. You make the earth uninhabitable. So the question of the 21st century is that old question of the right to abode, the right to inhabit the entirety of the planet, at a time when, as we see almost everywhere, many abodes are being rendered uninhabitable for those who are there. That's why they want to leave. They want to leave because the abode has been rendered uninhabitable. So the question is, how do we recover some sense of habitability where, as I was arguing earlier on, I don't have to justify who I am and why I look the way I look. It entails the end of classification. The end of classification as the opening of the world to all who inhabit it, people and things. So that's what, the whole exercise, that is what it was.
I want to say that we do have more opportunity for conversation in the reception to come, and it seems to me that that extraordinary summarizing statement, an extraordinary summarizing statement, not a utopian one, but nonetheless a futuristic one, and one that shows us the amazing challenges to humanity as a whole that you are posing to us. That has to be a place where we stop this part of the conversation at least and move on. So thank you so much to our main speaker, Achille Mbembe, and to our panelists, Inderpal and Michael.
Thanks, Michael.